You're listening to vNacelle Insights, where we bring you valuable information on accelerating business value, business transitions, employee engagement, visual process mapping, self-awareness, and entrepreneurial excellence. Hello, everyone. This is Kevin with vNacelle. Today, we will be hearing from vNacelle co-partner and employment engagement expert, Jimmy Taylor. Jimmy is a 20-plus year leader, entrepreneur, HR leader, speaker, consultant, and executive coach. He's a partner in BizMultiplier, a company dedicated to providing tools and resources that help companies grow engaged employees. He also works with companies to develop and grow entrepreneurial management teams that can increase the value of their business. Join us now as we listen to the first half of this hour-long presentation, titled Talent Games, Hiring and Managing for Better Employee Engagement.
Thank you so much for joining us for the first WeBack West WBE Expert Series webinar for 2018. We are excited that you are participating. Just a reminder, you have been placed on mute as you enter the webinar. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will respond to those. And we are excited to have Jimmy Taylor with us today. So Jimmy, if you would like to take it away.
Thank you, Ellie. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to spending the next hour with you guys. Just to set the stage, webinars are always a little interesting because I can't judge the interaction of the audience. I don't get to see your face. But please feel free to respond by chat message with questions. Ellie may interrupt at some point and we'll answer those questions as we go. Or certainly we're going to save a couple of minutes at the end to respond as well. And just by way of introduction in terms of my interest in employee engagement and my passion around it, I think two things that are important. One is, as a business owner, I had a company for 16 years that we were relatively small, less than 200 employees, operating in a very competitive market. Our corporate office was in Austin, Texas, and a lot of companies were moving into Austin, and our employees were we think pretty well thought of and certainly targeted, and so we had a hard time keeping people for a while. So we started looking at some engagement and retention strategies that made a big difference for us. The work that we did, we actually did recruiting for companies, and we would take over their hiring process, and they were highly interested because they were facing the same problem as well. So that really spurred it, and then the work I do today is mostly around helping business owners transition their business. A lot of them are family-owned businesses or trying to figure out as they age what to do with this enterprise that they've built. And developing a management team and retaining their staff is often a crucial element of getting them positioned to transition to the family or transition to employees or even a third-party sale. So that really drives my passion, and what I found out is there's actually a lot of things that we can do to make a difference, and we'll be talking about some of those today. Let's talk for just a second, though, about an easy question just to kind of get your mind focused on the next few minutes we have together. When you look at the picture that's on your screen, you see a glass that's approximately 50% filled. I promise you a question comes to mind. You've been programmed for a question. You know, get that in your mind. I'll put the answer up on the screen. You were thinking, how much does the water in the glass weigh, right? Chances are the question you had in mind was actually different than what I just put up on the screen. But the point is, I think we often do that with employee engagement. We have some presuppositions that cause us to ask the wrong questions about engagement. And I think that's one of the reasons potentially engagement has been stuck for quite a while. And we'll look at some examples of how we know employee engagement is relatively stuck in the U.S. currently. But let's talk about our goals for the next few minutes as we get started. First, we're going to look at some of the macro challenges companies face with poor engagement and turnover in what my business partner and I call the people era that we do believe we've entered into. And it's really important, I think, for business leaders for us to understand that we tend to think it's a localized problem or a temporary challenge because of a competitive, hot economy that we're in. And certainly those factors do influence it, and they do add to the stress. But actually what we'll look at is some statistics on a macro level that show that this is, except for periods of recession that will always come and go in our economy, except for those periods, this is an ongoing problem and an ongoing issue we're going to face, which is why it's really important we think about strategies that we can use to improve it. And it'll give us a clear differentiate over our competitors. Then we're going to look at some of the best practices, kind of dive down a little deeper into the weeds to look at selection, onboarding, and management engagement. We'll look at statistically what works for organizations who started to turn this around. And then we're going to talk a bit about how to coach managers to lead their teams to high performance and engagement. As managers, we carry this awesome burden of leadership, and we don't actually get a lot of training for it oftentimes. So we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to help managers solve that. It's a lot to cover in the next 45 or 50 minutes together, so let's jump in. As I said, engagement really is stuck in our economy. Gallup does probably the best job of all the big companies who attempt to measure that statistically. And if you look back to 2000, which is when they started collecting data, it's improved a bit. We've kind of bounced between about 26 and 32 or 33% of engaged employees. And engaged employees is basically somebody who shows up doing their very best. They provide the discretionary effort that they have available to really apply their skills and abilities and best efforts to the job at hand. But it's really important to note, as an economy, as a country, we're spending about $1 billion a year on engagement strategies. And clearly what we're doing is not moving the needle nearly enough. Not engaged employees is the gray bar in the middle. That one's been fairly consistent as well. And then actively disengaged employees, those are the people that actually are destructive to our workforce. They're toxic to our environment. They very much are destroying the good work that our engaged employees do on a daily basis, and that number has been relatively consistent as well. So clearly what we're doing is not working, and let's talk about maybe some things we could do a little bit differently. A quick note on the U.S. labor force. As you can see from the graph that's on your screen, the baby boomers were the largest generation of U.S. workers, and for those of us who are baby boomers, I always say we're going to eventually retire or die in our cubicles. But we're on the decline. We're slowly starting to retire. We gave way for a bit to the millennials. They were actually the largest employee base in our workforce for a few weeks, and then they were, the Gen Xers were, and then they were bypassed by the millennials. The millennials are actually peaking. The labor force that they represent will be plateauing over the next year or two, as they're pretty much all in the workforce based on their age. And so you can tell they will not be nearly as large an impact on the workforce as the boomers were. About 10 million less millennials in the workforce than the baby boomers were at their peak. But what's really interesting about this slide is if you look at the silence, there were 3.7 million silent generation workers still in the U.S. workforce at the end of 2015, which meant they would have been 71 or 72 years old. That's a lot of, when I do this in person, I've done this for over a year, lots of different groups, and I always ask the oldest age of the employees that they have in their workforce. And I've not had a group yet that didn't have employees in their 70s in their workforce, at least one or two companies. I was in Oklahoma City last year. I had two different companies who each had a full-time employee working 40 hours a week who was over age 90. And here's what the workforce is going to look like if you've got the average workforce in 2020, which is only 2 years from now. More than 1 in 3 of your employees will be over age 55. 1 in 5 will be over age 65, and then about 1 in 10 will be over age 75. So the workforce is really aging. That has some implications for this engagement conversation. We'll talk about that as well. It's going to look very different as we have 5 generations in the workforce. As the next generation, what I think is called the I generation, they really haven't settled on the name, but as that next generation starts to enter the workforce in the next couple of years. And then the other thing that really has companies, leaders worried, and economists as well, is we really have a declining workforce based on participation rates. The workforce participation rate has been declining for a while. It actually plateaued in 2017. We don't know if that's going to be a turnaround or not, but just people who have chosen for whatever reason who are workforce eligible age-wise, just not to participate or unable. Some of that is because their skills don't match the skills the workforce needs. And really what we're seeing in the workforce is right now we have a skills gap. I need to hire a CDL truck driver, and the only people who are applying are Starbucks baristas. In a few years, the Starbucks baristas won't even be applying because there simply won't be enough bodies to do the work that we have, which, again, as leaders makes us really cognizant of the fact that this needs to be a strategy that we need to act on and not just a response to what we think may be a temporary problem. And then the perfect slide to expand on that worker shortage coming up, the perfect slide, it ought to be immediately clear to you what you're seeing. It shouldn't be confusing. It should make one point, the words shouldn't be too small. It should be something like this, right? I'm sure that was very clear to you immediately. Really, I put this up only for one reason. If you look at the first two columns of blue and red, that's the labor force in the year 2020. The last two, which is mostly red, is the labor force in 2030, based on either a 10-year or a 20-year traditional historic growth rate for that company. These are the major economies of the world. And the point of the slide is you can see that right now most countries are still in the blue, or they don't have a severe shortage. As we grow, as the years go by, almost every industrialized nation will face a shortage of workers. And what that typically does is that slows immigration, because people typically move for a better job. Gallup wrote a great book on that a few years ago called What the Whole World Wants. There are other factors that influence immigration, religious persecution and the like. But by and large, when jobs are available in a local economy, people tend to migrate less, which means even the strategy that a lot of countries have had of bringing workers in to fill the gap will be very difficult, which makes it even more imperative for us as leaders to really perfect a strategy with our own organization. 80% of CEOs are worried about their company's ability to attract talent, according to a study that was in Harvard Business Review last year. And then PricewaterhouseCoopers study of CEOs said that more than 60% of companies said their growth is already negatively impacted because they can't find the key skills that they need to do the job. And then IBM tried to quantify it. IBM, in a report that was just released last month, said that the U.S. will see a talent shortage of 23 million workers by the year 2020, which is, pretty quick. Some other interesting stats from a favorite CEO of mine, a guy who runs an organization called Barry Waymiller, a CEO named Bob Chapman, who I think has done a terrific job of really leading the charge within his organization of changing the engagement strategy. But 88% of our employees believe the organization doesn't care about them. 75% of disengaged employees and don't believe their role has any meaningful impact on the company results. They feel like the work they do every day is not important to the work that the company does. Work in finances is the leading cause of stress. Heart attacks actually spiked by a little over 20% on Monday morning, so certainly the workforce plays a part in that. And this was from a study that Mayo Clinic released last year. The person you report to at work is actually more important to your physical health than who you choose as your family physician. So this challenge of engagement and what we're doing to employees, it certainly has some ramifications in terms of the financial impact of our organizations, and we're going to talk about those here in just a couple of slides. But again, it goes beyond just the financial return. It's really a challenge as a country. It's something that we're seeing impacts the health of people. Some people have said you really can't change it. It just doesn't matter. Just adopt a philosophy that says I'll plug in the next person that comes along and make work interchangeable. Let's look at the financial results that would indicate that that's not exactly accurate. Gallup, again, who has done more work than anybody on this, says that the average company has an engaged to not engaged ratio of 1.8 engaged employees for everyone who's not engaged. So if you and I have the average company, that's what we're seeing with our workforce. A high-performing company, if you look at customer satisfaction growth, profitability of the business, have an engagement ratio of 10 engaged employees for everyone who's not engaged. So clearly, in terms of the bottom line financial impact, it has tremendous ramifications. The top 5% of employees produce 400% of a firm's total output, and on average, they only cost us 20% more. That was from a study done by the University of Wisconsin that was published in Personal Psychology magazine. And then if you're familiar with the term conscious capitalism, if you think about conscious capitalism firms, Think about companies like Whole Foods, Southwest Airlines, the Container Store. Those are companies who have a firm commitment to conscious capitalism. And really the concept there, if you're not familiar with it, is pretty basic. We all treat our customers as an important stakeholder, our business, of course. We treat our investors, our shareholders as stakeholders. We treat our vendors as stakeholders as well. And conscious capitalism firms have said we're going to treat our employees as an important stakeholder as well, and we're going to make business decisions not only in light of how they impact our customers and our vendors, but also how they impact our employees. And any analysis of the financial performance of conscious capitalism firms, they greatly outperform their competitors who don't have that same philosophy. This particular one was a 15-year study. Their average rate of return was 21% versus a 6.5% return for the Standard & Poor's 500. So I hope I've convinced you that engagement really does matter. On average, if you have above average employee engagement, you'll have twice the success rate of a below average business in your industry. If you can get your company to the 99th percentile in terms of employee engagement, you'll have a success rate that's 5 times that of the first percentile. So oftentimes we're not really cognizant of the financial impact, but it has huge ramifications. And certainly it has ramifications as we care about people as well. Robert Reich had a great quote about that. The only unique asset that a business has for gaining a sustained competitive advantage over its rivals is its workforce, the skills and dedication of its employees. There's simply no other sustainable advantage in the modern high-tech global economy. And while if you were maybe Google or Facebook, I might argue that you do have some other advantages. But for most of us, there's a business next door, down the street, in the next community over that does arguably the same thing we do in terms of products or services, and it is our people that's the clear differentiator. Most leaders are not sure where to begin on this issue. In a survey that Deloitte did, 93% of company leadership surveyed said that they recognize that they need to change their strategies about talent, both in the way they acquire them and the way they manage them once they are with their company. But 2/3 of them haven't taken the first step yet. And I think it's really just a lack of understanding of what that first step should be, and maybe a little bit of fear. I love this quote by Alberto Salazar. He was the 3-time winner of the New York City Marathon. He said, "I had as many doubts as anyone else. Standing on the starting line, we're all cowards." So I would say that getting different and better business results starts with moving and changing people, and the workforce requires it. Certainly the workforce of the future and the shortage that we likely are facing of employees will really demand it. But it is an intentional journey that's not taken without a little bit of fear, and maybe some ideas that we'll dive into here in a second. We'll give you some starting points that you could adopt within your own organization. Let's look for a second about how much turnover is costing you, though. This is a pretty common area of misconception. Even when I ask chief financial officers a lot of times what their turnover cost is, they're either not sure or they respond with their cost of hire, which is a vastly lower number. In most organizations, turnover costs at a minimum 25 to 50% of the annual base salary, and the higher you go up kind of the food chain, if you will, in terms of the degree of difficulty of the job, the more expensive it gets. And certainly it's not unusual to find an organization when you really truly calculate the hard cost of turnover, which is people's time and paperwork and interview time and all those things that go into it, along with the soft costs, lost productivity when an exiting employee is leaving, lost productivity of the new employee until they get up to speed. When you figure in those soft costs, I've never seen one that was less than 50% of base salary. Even looking at $15, $16 an hour factory workers, $30,000 to $32,000 a year. It's usually $14,000 to $16,000 a minimum when you truly calculate the soft cost. And what's really interesting, if you look at this graph that's on the screen now, our people aren't productive on the first day of employment. There's a point when we're just making an investment in them, and then at some point, depending on the skill set, 30, 60, 90 days out, maybe even longer, depending on the degree of difficulty of their job, the organization starts to gain a return on that investment. And if those people leave before you have started to get a return, the next time you're hiring, you're actually now in a deficit. You've lost money on that hire that just left, and you're starting all over, and it takes you even longer to build. The point is, oftentimes we're spending so much more money on this retention, on this turnover issue, and we think we don't have maybe the funds to spend in management training or things that would help solve it. And it is a leap of faith. It does take courageous patience to jump out there, but we're often spending the dollars anyway in other areas, and what we're talking about maybe is redirecting them. And so where do we begin as leaders? Now that we've looked at enough graphs and talked about enough costs to be deeply depressed and uncertain about our future, first we do really need to stop to understand the financial impact. And it's not in this slide deck, and we will make this slide deck available to you after the webinar if you'd like it. But I do have a turnover cost calculator. My email address will be at the end. I'm happy to send that to you just to start your thinking in terms of working through what your financial impact is of turnover. And then once we understand the financial impact, craft what I call an actionable people vision. What are we doing to positively impact people? Because when we positively impact them, we start to retain them, and we start to see their performance and their engagement change and move up. And then developing a roadmap that says, what are we going to really align on and focus to drive higher engagement within our teams? One last note on kind of the stats as we start. Why do people leave? Why is there limited engagement? The number one reason is always managers. I picked Gallup's numbers because theirs was actually the lowest of any I've ever looked at. Deloitte, all the major consulting firms track causes for employee turnover. Most of the time it's north of 60%. Gallup says 54% of turnover is directly the first level manager's responsibility. A job mismatch, I'm doing a different job than I thought I was going to be doing when I hired on will cause people to leave. Safety, if I showed up this morning at your workplace with 10 fingers and 10 toes, and I don't believe that I'm likely to go home with all 10 of those fingers and toes, I'm likely going to seek employment somewhere else. There's almost nothing you can do to keep me long term if that's an issue. Comp and benefits, our managers almost always say this is the number one reason when somebody leaves, oh, we got a better offer. We didn't pay enough. If I could raise my money, I could keep more people. That's a fallacy almost every case. Now, the lower someone is on the pay scale, the lower they are in the socioeconomic ladder, the more that 50 cents or an hour really makes to them. So if your employee base is on the low end of that it does go up a little bit. And then learning, there's actually two phases of learning. There's learning for today's job and then learning for advancement and growth into tomorrow's job. So those are the big reasons that people choose to leave our organizations. Connexus did an interesting study last year. The more employees like their boss, their direct boss, their first-line supervisor, the more they like their pay, their benefits, and their development advancement opportunities with the company. If they don't like the boss, they don't like anything about the company. The commute was terrible. The benefits were awful. The training was terrible. Everything about the company was bad, and it's all attributable to that relationship with that first-level manager. So there's a mismatch between what science knows and what business does, according to Daniel Pink, and I think he's absolutely right. We have focused on some things that we thought would fix engagement, and we've kind of ignored the behavioral science piece behind what's really causing people to exit our organizations. So here's the most impactful engagement strategies for selection and management as we enter into this people era.
And that's where we're going to stop with the first half of this webinar given by Jimmy Taylor on employee engagement. To find out more about those strategies, join us next week for the second half of Talent Games, Hiring and Managing for Better Employee Engagement. For more information on employee engagement consulting and the other programs offered by vNacelle, please check out our website, www.vnacelle.com. That's www.vnacelle.com. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.